January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls in silence, thick and suffocating. It blankets the skeletal trees and muffles the distant rumble of artillery. In a frozen farmhouse cellar near Houffalize, a young Panzer grenadier named Klaus Hartmann presses his back against damp stone, clutching his KR-98K with fingers gone numb. He can hear them before he sees them, a guttural, mechanical snarl cutting through the winter stillness, not the steady growl of a Jeep, not the grinding treads of a Sherman. This sound is different, primal, a throttled roar that rises and falls like a predator circling its prey. Then, through the grey veil of snow, they emerge, motorcycles, low and black, with a chrome glint beneath the frost, and mounted on their sidecars, swiveling with brutal efficiency, are the unmistakable barrels of .50 caliber machine guns. Hartmann's breath catches. He has heard the stories whispered in aid stations and along retreat routes. Stories of American riders who moved like ghosts, who struck without warning and vanished before the counterfire could begin. Stories of bikes that didn't merely scout, they hunted. The German soldiers had a name for them, spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Teufels Motorräder, devil bikes. The marriage of the Harley-Davidson motorcycle and the Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun was not born from grand strategy or doctrinal innovation. It was born from necessity, improvisation, and the uniquely American belief that if something moved, you could probably mount a gun on it. By the winter of 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, the need for rapid reconnaissance and mobile firepower became urgent. Traditional armored vehicles were too slow, too loud, too vulnerable in the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes and the Vosges. Jeeps offered mobility, but they lacked the speed and maneuverability required to exploit gaps in German lines or respond to sudden ambushes. And so, in workshops behind the front lines, American engineers and mechanics began to experiment. They took the Harley-Davidson WLA rugged 45 cubic inch V-twin motorcycle already proven in military service and fitted its sidecar with a pedestal mount. On that mount, they placed the M2 Browning, a weapon capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute, punching through armor plating and turning bunkers into sieves. The result was a weapon system that weighed less than 800 pounds fully loaded, could reach speeds over 65 miles per hour on open terrain, and delivered firepower equivalent to a light armored vehicle. It was audacious, it was reckless. It was unmistakably American. For the German soldiers who encountered them, the devil bikes represented something far more unsettling than tactical innovation. They represented a kind of warfare that defied the European understanding of combat, a warfare built not on attrition or positional defense, but on speed, shock, and overwhelming material superiority. The Wehrmacht has spent 5 years perfecting the art of mechanized warfare, coordinating tanks, infantry, and air power with ruthless precision. But this was something else. This was cavalry reimagined for the industrial age, a throwback to the mounted raiders of the steppes, now armed with weapons that could shred a half-track at 500 yards, and behind each rider was not a desperate, resource-starved conscript, but a well-fed, well-trained volunteer who seemed to relish the chaos. German intelligence reports from late 1944 and early 1945 make frequent reference to motorcycle reconnaissance units operating with unusual aggression and autonomy. One captured document, dated February 3, 1945, describes an encounter near St. Vith. Enemy motorcycle patrols have become increasingly bold. They strike at dawn or dusk, targeting supply columns and communication lines. The sound of their engines is unmistakable, a deep, rhythmic growl that announces their presence but offers no time to prepare. By the time positions are manned, they have already withdrawn. Casualties are disproportionate to the size of the attacking force. The phrase Teufels Motorräder appears in the margins of the report, underlined twice. What the Germans expected in those final months of the war was an enemy ground down by attrition, slowed by the winter, vulnerable in the narrow defiles of the Ardennes. What they encountered instead was an enemy that refused to be slowed, that adapted faster than doctrine. could be rewritten, and that brought to bear a level of material abundance that bordered on the surreal. The .50 caliber machine gun itself became a symbol of this abundance. German forces by 1945 were rationing ammunition, cannibalizing vehicles for spare parts, and issuing obsolete weapons to Volkssturm units. The Americans, by contrast, were mounting .50 cals on motorcycles, half-tracks, jeeps, trucks, and even experimental helicopters. Each belt-fed gun required hundreds of pounds of linked ammunition, each round precision machined from brass and steel. The fact that the Americans could afford to waste such munitions on harassment fire and suppression, could afford to mount such weapons on platforms as expendable as a motorcycle, spoke to an industrial capacity that the Third Reich could no longer hope to match. It was not just a weapon. It was a proclamation, a declaration that the American war machine had so much material, so much excess, that it could afford to experiment, to improvise, to turn scouting missions into armored raids. The riders themselves were often drawn from motorcycle clubs, dispatch units, and reconnaissance battalions. They were men who understood engines, who had grown up on farms or in garages, who could strip a carburetor blindfolded and jury-rig a fuel line with wire and tape. They were not elite commandos or specially trained operatives. They were mechanics and farm boys and factory workers given a bike, a gun, and a mandate to raise hell. And they did. Accounts from the Battle of the Bulge describe Harley-Davidson units operating behind German lines, targeting fuel depots, ammunition convoys, and command posts. They moved in pairs or small groups, coordinating by radio or hand signals, appearing at dawn to strafe a column and disappearing into the forest before artillery could be called in. They were not there to hold ground. They were there to disrupt, to demoralize, to remind the enemy that nowhere was safe. One American sergeant interviewed decades later recalled, "We weren't trying to win battles on those bikes. We were trying to make them afraid, make them look over their shoulder, make them hear that engine in their sleep." The psychological impact was immense. The sound of a Harley-Davidson V-twin, a deep, syncopated rumble, became associated with sudden violence, with ambush, with death arriving at 60 miles per hour. But the devil bikes were not merely instruments of terror. They were symbols of something deeper, something that gnawed at the ideological foundations of the Nazi regime. National Socialism had built its narrative on the myth of German technological and martial superiority, on the idea that the Aryan soldier, disciplined and self-sacrificing, would triumph over the decadent, materialistic West. And yet here were American soldiers, riding motorcycles that cost more than a month's wages, firing guns that consume ammunition like water, moving with a freedom and autonomy that no Wehrmacht officer would have granted his men. They did not fight for Lebensraum or racial destiny. They fought because they had been asked to, because the job needed doing, and because they had the tools to do it. The abundance was not incidental, it was ideological. It was a refutation of scarcity, of sacrifice, of the grim austerity that fascism demanded. Every .50 caliber round fired from a devil bike was a reminder that the American economy could outproduce, outspend, and outlast any regime built on conquest and subjugation. The transformation in German perception was gradual but undeniable. In the early years of the war, Wehrmacht propaganda had mocked American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, reliant on machines rather than courage. But by 1945, that narrative had collapsed. The soldiers who survived encounters with the devil bikes did not speak of cowardice or weakness. They spoke of efficiency, of ruthlessness, of an enemy that adapted faster than they could react. One captured Fallschirmjäger officer, interrogated in March 1945, admitted, "We were told the Americans would break when the snow fell, when the supply lines stretched thin. But they did not break. They became faster, more aggressive. They turned our own tactics against OS, speed, surprise, firepower, and they did it with machines we could never hope to match." The devil bikes had become proof that the American way of war, decentralized, improvisational, materially abundant, was not a weakness, it was a strength. And at the heart of it all was the bike itself. The Harley-Davidson WLA was not a precision instrument. It leaked oil, vibrated at high speeds, and required constant maintenance. But it was durable, repairable, and most importantly, available. Harley-Davidson had produced over 88,000 military motorcycles during the war, shipping them to every theater, every front, every corner of the Allied advance. They were not elegant machines. They were workhorses, tools built to be used and discarded if necessary. And yet, in the hands of American riders, they became something more. They became symbols of mobility, of freedom, of a nation that could afford to waste resources on experimentation and still win. The chrome glint of the handlebars, the rumble of the V-twin, the rhythmic chatter of the .50 cal, they became the signature of a new kind of warfare, one that did not wait for orders or follow doctrine, but moved and adapted and struck wherever opportunity appeared. By the spring of 1945, as the Reich crumbled and the front lines dissolved, the devil bikes had become legend. They appeared in German diaries, in after-action reports, in the whispered conversations of prisoners. They were spoken of with the same grim respect that German tankers reserved for Soviet T-34 seconds or American P-47 seconds. They had earned their name not through propaganda or myth-making, but through the simple, brutal arithmetic of warfare. They killed more than they lost, they moved faster than they could be counted, and they never stopped coming. The psychological toll was as significant as the tactical one. German soldiers, already demoralized by months of retreat and dwindling supplies, now faced an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources, infinite creativity, infinite will. The devil bikes were proof that America had not merely matched German industrial capacity, it had surpassed it so complete that it could afford to mount .50 caliber machine guns on motorcycles and send them hunting through the winter forests. The epilogue of the devil bikes is not found in any grand battle or decisive engagement. It is found in the quiet moments after the war, in the memories of men who rode them and the men who fled from them. The Harley-Davidsons were decommissioned, sold as surplus, scattered across the world. Some ended up on farms, others in scrapyards. A few were kept as souvenirs, their sidecar mounts removed, their wartime scars polished away. But the sound remained, that deep, unmistakable rumble carried forward by veterans who returned home and rebuilt their lives on two wheels. The motorcycles became symbols of freedom once again, not the freedom of nations, but the freedom of the open road, of movement without permission, of autonomy earned and defended. And in the ruins of Germany, in the cellars and bunkers and shattered cities, the memory lingered, the memory of a sound in the snow, a mechanical growl that heralded not just defeat, but the arrival of a new world order, a world where abundance defeated austerity, where improvisation triumphed over doctrine, where a motorcycle with a machine gun could become a legend. The devil bikes were never meant to change the course of the war. They were a footnote, an improvisation, a solution to a tactical problem. But in their roar, in their chrome and steel, in the way they moved through the winter forests like harbingers of a new age, they carried a truth that transcended tactics. They carried the truth that freedom, real freedom, is not won through sacrifice alone. It is won through the will to adapt, to innovate, to refuse the limitations that history imposes. And sometimes that truth arrives at 65 miles per hour, mounted on a Harley-Davidson with a .50 caliber machine gun and a rider who knows that the road ahead is uncertain, but the engine will not fail. The Germans called them devil bikes, but they were something simpler and far more dangerous. They were American.